The sun had barely risen, casting long golden rays over the rows of grapevines, the morning mist curling gently around the trunks and leaves, and the vineyard seemed to breathe in its quiet, untouched beauty, a sanctuary where time slowed and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves and distant birdsong. But that serene moment shattered the instant the HOA board members appeared at the edge of the property, marching up the dirt path with papers fluttering in their hands, faces flushed with indignation and self-importance, their footsteps crunching sharply against the gravel as if announcing the coming storm. And before I could fully process their presence, one of them thrust a stack of fines and complaint notices toward me, the paper trembling slightly in their outstretched hand, and snapped, "You can't do that here. This is HOA property." Their voices cut through the morning air like a whip, sharp and accusatory, bouncing off the vine-laden hills and the wooden posts of the old fence that lined the vineyard, and I froze for just a moment, caught between disbelief and rising anger, glancing at the documents they waved so dramatically, each one an attempt to assert authority over a space I had walked for years, tended carefully, and loved fiercely, a space they had no real claim to, a truth that the unfolding drama would soon reveal. The tension was palpable, the kind that makes the skin prick, the air feel heavier. The birds stopped their song for a heartbeat, and I could feel the weight of every eye in the group fixated on me as if their combined scrutiny could enforce the law they believed they wielded, but could not, and my pulse quickened not out of fear but anticipation, because I knew the deeper truth, something that would soon turn the tables entirely in my favor, yet at that very moment, all that existed was the chaos of confrontation. The jumbled shouts of HOA members pointing at vines, pathways, and even the grape-laden trellises, their arguments tangled in legal jargon, procedural threats, and a stubborn certainty that they were in charge when in reality they had stepped onto property I legally owned without understanding the ramifications of their own audacity. Just as one of the members, red-faced and flustered, began dialing a number on her phone with trembling hands, presumably to summon police reinforcement, the others continued to bark over each other, waving the offending fines like weapons, their gestures exaggerated, almost comically theatrical. As though the power of their indignation could magically make the documents enforceable, yet each word, each motion, only highlighted their lack of authority, and their lack of awareness that the vineyard, the rolling hills beyond it, and the sunlit valley stretching to the distant tree line were legally mine, a fact that I held quietly, privately, savoring the sweet irony that they were literally inviting trouble onto the land I controlled, oblivious to the consequences of their intrusion. In that suspended moment, the camera would linger on their faces, the disbelief, the outrage, the fumbling attempts to regain composure as if to exaggerate the absurdity of the scene, while I remained still, calm, and collected, my gaze sweeping across the vineyard I had nurtured for years, each row of grapes a testament to time, patience, and care, and my mind traced back to the countless hours spent tending the soil, trimming the vines, and watching sunlight dance across leaves, all of which now provided a silent but potent argument against the hollowness of their complaints. The crunch of gravel beneath their shoes, the shuffle of papers, the rising urgency in their voices, it all blended into a symphony of chaos, a moment frozen in time, perfect for the dramatic freeze frame that would later serve as a hook. The split second where they were certain of their control, unaware of the real power lying just beneath the surface, and where I could imagine the voiceover cutting in, low and suspenseful. Little did they know, this land was already mine. The irony hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of damp earth and ripening grapes, and in that instant, it was impossible not to notice the contrast, their frantic energy, their sense of impending triumph, set against the calm dignity of the vineyard. The sunlight and my quiet patience, the disparity almost comical in its sharpness, yet edged with tension, because although I had the upper hand legally, the spectacle of confrontation created a visceral drama that demanded attention, demanded emotion, and demanded that the audience feel the stakes in every flick of a hand, every pointed finger, and every exasperated shout. The police, when they arrived 6 minutes later, added another layer of tension, their uniforms crisp, their expressions professional but curious as they surveyed the scene, taking in the flurry of HOA gesturing, the waving documents, and the faint scowl of a few neighbors who had wandered out to witness the commotion. And yet, even in their presence, the absurdity of the situation was undeniable. Officers attempting to mediate between a group of overzealous board members and a calm, composed vineyard owner who had all the legal rights on his side. A visual and emotional tableau that set the tone for the story to come. Every close-up in this cinematic opening would capture micro-expressions, sweat beading on foreheads, eyes widening in disbelief, lips forming tight lines of anger or confusion, while my own face remained composed, eyes scanning the horizon, fingers brushing lightly over the top of the nearest vine, a small, almost imperceptible smirk betraying the satisfaction of knowing the truth that they did not, that their attempt at authority was already doomed by the simple fact that they had no claim here, no standing, and no comprehension of ownership that stretched far beyond the rows of grapes they so eagerly tried to regulate. In that blend of chaos and serenity, the vineyard became almost a character itself, the rows of vines whispering in the breeze, the morning light reflecting off the dew, and each element working in concert to underscore the tension, the drama, and the impending revelation, creating not just a moment of conflict, but a cinematic scene rich with visual storytelling. The perfect opening to a saga where patience, strategy, and quiet power would dominate over arrogance, petty authority, and ignorance. As the HOA members argued louder, gesturing towards specific sections of the vineyard, citing non-existent rules, and even attempting to drag the police into their dispute, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, knowing that every flustered shout, every futile attempt to assert dominance, was playing out exactly as anticipated, that this initial confrontation, though chaotic and dramatic, was only the first act in a story that would soon reveal the full scope of ownership, control, and the consequences of underestimating someone who had quietly, meticulously, and legally positioned himself as the master of the valley. The visual montage could cut from wide aerials of sun-drenched vineyards, capturing the full scope of property and the serene beauty of the landscape, to tight close-ups of hands gripping papers, eyes darting, and lips forming exclamations, emphasizing the dramatic irony and emotional tension, while my own relaxed posture and steady gaze underscored the inevitability of the narrative, that despite all their shouting, the chaos, and the police presence, the outcome was already determined, set by law, logic, and foresight. By the end of this chapter, the audience would feel the full emotional hookshock at the confrontation, frustration at the absurdity of the HOA's aggression, and disbelief at the mounting tension, while the freeze-frame CTA lingers in their minds, a promise of revelation, strategy, and eventual triumph as the story unfolds, leaving them on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how this vineyard, this valley, and its rightful owner would respond to the overreach and arrogance of those who had mistakenly thought they held power over a space they had no claim to. The cinematic beat is complete when the camera lingers on my hand brushing over the vineyard gate, the sunlight catching the edge of the property deed tucked discreetly in my pocket, and a slow zoom into my calm, confident expression, setting the tone for a story of patience, revenge, and ultimate victory, leaving viewers hooked, emotionally invested, and eager for the next chapter of the saga where strategy, law, and foresight will outmatch hubris and ignorance. Growing up, my summers were defined by sun-drenched fields, the smell of fresh earth and budding grapes, and the slow, rhythmic work of tending to family land that had been nurtured for generations. Lessons in patience, perseverance, and respect for nature woven into every chore. Every early morning walk through the vineyards with my father, whose hands were rough but gentle, showing me how to prune vines, how to gauge when grapes were ready for harvest, how to listen to the land and respond with care rather than force, and those lessons, simple as they seemed at the time, planted seeds of pride, love, and connection that would later become the backbone of my identity, the quiet foundation upon which all of my values rested. And as I watched the sun rise over the same rows of grapes that my family had tended, I could almost hear echoes of those childhood lessons whispering in the breeze. A reminder that the land was more than soil and vines. It was legacy, it was life, and it was mine by inheritance, by right, and by the blood, sweat, and devotion poured into it over decades. As I grew, the vineyards became my sanctuary, a place where I could think, plan, and breathe, the rows of vines stretching endlessly before me like living corridors of memory. each leaf shimmering in the sunlight a reflection of the countless days I had spent learning to care for something larger than myself. And it was in this space, grounded in family and nature, that I first encountered the small but persistent irritations of the HOA, those minor conflicts that seemed insignificant at first, a misdirected letter about fence height, a complaint about the placement of a small shed, a suggestion that our irrigation system encroached on community property, but over time, the petty attention to arbitrary rules and the insistence on control began to gnaw at me, a slow erosion of patience that transformed mild annoyance into simmering frustration, planting the seeds of a longer, more strategic plan. The HOA president, the archetypal Karen figure, became the embodiment of this petty authority, sharp-tongued, rigid, and convinced of her own infallibility. She wielded her rules like weapons. Obsessed with enforcing regulations no one else noticed or cared about, her every word dripping with superiority, as though the vineyards themselves, the land that had been here long before she had arrived, somehow belonged to her judgment, and her husband, a developer with a relentless eye for profit, seemed to echo and amplify her arrogance, both of them together creating a force of entitlement that I could neither ignore nor confront lightly, yet one that I knew would eventually demand a response. My memories often drifted back to specific moments, like the first HOA letter criticizing the alignment of a grapevine trellis, the meeting where they insisted I needed permission to plant a new row of vines, the day they tried to impose fines for what I knew were my legal rights, each incident, small as it was, layering over the previous one, creating a narrative of tension, of control versus freedom, and instilling in me a growing awareness that those who wield authority without understanding its limits are often the most dangerous, because they act from hubris rather than reason, and they mistake fear for compliance. Amidst these recollections, I remembered the laughter of neighbors who, though polite, often shared quiet glances during HOA meetings, whispers of disbelief at the absurdity of rules being enforced over something as organic and ancient as a vineyard. And those moments, small and fleeting though they were, provided comfort and validation, showing me that my sense of justice, my attachment to the land, and my resolve to protect it were not isolated, but part of a broader understanding that property, legacy, and respect for hard work trumped bureaucratic pettiness, even when wielded by someone as determined as the HOA president. The narrative of my past was also marked by an intimacy with the land, a relationship that went beyond ownership. It was communion with nature, with the seasons, with the subtle changes that only someone who had spent years observing could understand, the early spring shoots, the summer sun ripening grapes, the autumn harvest that was both labor and celebration, and the winter dormancy that promised renewal, all of which grounded me in a rhythm that the rigid schedules and arbitrary rules of the HOA could never disrupt, no matter how loud their complaints, no matter how officious their letters. Introducing the antagonist further, her arrogance was evident in every gesture, every word, every insistence that I adhere to regulations that seemed contrived and irrelevant, yet she carried herself as though the vineyard and valley itself were extensions of her will. Her eyes scanning the property with the meticulous judgment of someone convinced that control equaled morality, and her insistence on oversight clashed with my own deeply held belief that stewardship, care, and respect for the land were far more meaningful than any rule penned on HOA letterhead, creating a tension that was almost theatrical in its intensity, a slow-burning conflict that would escalate until the ultimate confrontation could no longer be avoided. I could still recall the heated exchanges, the subtle digs disguised advice, the blatant misinterpretation of legal boundaries, each encounter a study in human pride and bureaucratic overreach, and each one contributing to a growing internal fire, the sense that I could not simply comply or ignore, but would need to assert control in a way that was both strategic and undeniable. A plan that would require patience, precision, and the careful use of law and legacy. The kind of plan that could only emerge from years of observing patterns, understanding people, and nurturing the land that was both my birthright and my sanctuary. In these reflections, nostalgia intertwined with anger. Memories of carefree childhood summers were tinged with the realization that those very landscapes I cherished were constantly under threat from petty authority. And yet, those same memories provided motivation, reminding me why the vineyards mattered, why my family's history mattered, and why standing up to someone who wielded power without principle was not just justified, but necessary. Emotional beats ran deep as I remembered late afternoons in the fields, sunlight streaming through leaves, the sound of distant cicadas, the rich scent of soil, and the quiet satisfaction of hands worn and dirty from honest labor, each sensory. Memory reinforcing my conviction that the vineyards, the valley, and my heritage could not be compromised, and that the arrogance of the HOA president, however intimidating in the moment, could ultimately be countered with foresight, patience, and a carefully executed plan. The tension between personal values and petty authority became a central theme in my internal monologue, a reflection on how those who sought to enforce control without understanding the deeper truths of life, the labor, the legacy, the love for land, were destined to clash with someone who had both the emotional and legal foundations to resist. And this internal narrative set the stage for the audience to understand not just the conflict with the HOA, but the very human stakes, the pride, the frustration, and the eventual satisfaction that would come when justice, strategy, and patience converged in my favor. Every detail, from the smell of crushed grapes underfoot to the way sunlight reflected off the dew-laden leaves in early morning, to the subtle sounds of nature whined in the vines, birds calling, the hum of bees, was infused with significance, reinforcing that this was not merely land to be fought over, but a living, breathing testament to family, history, and personal integrity, elements that the HOA could not comprehend and which made their attempts at control both absurd and predictably doomed. In essence, my backstory created a layered narrative: childhood attachment to land, formative lessons in patience and care, incremental frustration with petty HOA rules, introduction of a central antagonist whose arrogance and obsession with control would fuel conflict, and the emotional stakes of defending both legacy and principle, all while setting up a sense of inevitability that the coming confrontations would be about far more than fines or property lines. They would be about justice, empowerment, and reclaiming authority in a way that was legal, strategic, and undeniably satisfying. By the end of this chapter, the audience is fully immersed in my personal journey, understanding why the vineyard and valley are more than just property, why petty rules cannot override ownership and care, and why standing up to arrogance is not only justified but essential, creating anticipation and emotional engagement for the next chapter, where the seeds of strategy, confrontation, and eventual victory will begin to take root. The boardroom smelled of stale coffee and polished wood, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead as the HOA members sat stiffly around the long, thong, rectangular table, papers stacked neatly. In front of them, pens poised like weapons, each face etched with a mix of irritation, superiority, and thinly veiled triumph, as if the mere act of summoning me here had already granted them victory. But from the moment I stepped into the room, the balance of power felt different. A quiet but palpable tension threading through the air, winding around every chair, every folder, every pointed finger, and I could feel their disbelief even before a single word was spoken, their confidence rooted in routine and authority, blind to the fact that the vineyard and the valley behind me were mine, legally and irrevocably, and that this confrontation was merely a performance they were doomed to fail. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the president clearing her throat, adjusting her glasses, flipping open a binder, and launching into a recitation of alleged infractions, fines levied for unauthorized activities, and imagined violations that stretched the HOA's rules to absurdity, her voice rising with each paragraph, growing louder, more insistent, while I remained still, absorbing every syllable, noting the gestures, the clipped smiles, the shifting of papers, the way her eyes darted nervously at the board members who nodded along with forced enthusiasm, all the while calculating in my mind how this scene could serve as the first act of a larger plan, one that would completely overturn their assumptions, and assert a level of authority they could never comprehend. At one point, frustration welled inside me, a visceral, almost electric reaction that made my hands curl slightly, and I slammed my own palm on the table, not in anger, but in emphasis, and let my voice carry calmly but firmly over the room. You think a fine scares me? You have no idea what's coming. The words seemed to ripple across the polished surface of the table, bouncing from face to face, eliciting a momentary freeze, a collective inhale of disbelief, the subtle shift in body language betraying the first cracks in their constructed confidence, and in that pause, I allowed myself a brief internal smirk, recognizing the irony that the people who had summoned me to assert control were now suddenly exposed to the possibility that their authority was both limited and negotiable only on my terms. Every gesture, every glance, every twitch of their expression seemed amplified, the tension almost cinematic, as though the walls themselves absorbed the weight of impending change. And while they prattled on, attempting to reassert dominance, with rehearsed lines about rules and property rights, my mind traced the steps I had already begun taking, envisioning how the next moves would unfold, how patience, legal leverage, and careful planning would turn what looked like a negotiation into a revelation, a moment where the vineyard and valley, all that I had nurtured and defended, would assert their own voice through my actions, and the HOA would be left scrambling, powerless, staring at the truth they had refused to see. The president leaned forward, jabbing a pen at a clause in one of the documents, voice sharp and accusatory. "You can't just ignore these fines, they're binding under HOA policy." And I allowed a slow, deliberate smile to spread across my face, the corners lifting just enough to signal confidence, while my internal monologue churned with thoughts of strategy and, yes, revenge, but calculated, deliberate revenge, not the blind fury of someone cornered. Because I understood that the ultimate solution required more than anger, it required foresight, precision, and an understanding of leverage that they could never grasp, and in the back of my mind, I traced the contours of property maps, legal documents, past correspondences, and possible loopholes, each a piece of a puzzle that, when combined, would transform this petty confrontation into an undeniable assertion of ownership, authority, and strategic victory. The other board members murmured among themselves, glancing at one another, the air thick with frustration as they tried to anticipate my response, unaware that I was already several steps ahead, visualizing the eventual moment when the paperwork would be signed, the deeds exchanged, the full scope of the vineyard and valley legally recognized as mine, and the realization would hit them like a thunderclap. All their rules, all their fines, all their theatrics meaningless against the law and against careful planning. As the meeting progressed, they tried a series of tactics, the classic intimidation, appeals to precedent, even the faintly veiled threats, but each attempt only reinforced the inevitability of my plan, the absurdity of their overreach, and the dramatic irony that the audience, privy to my internal calculations, could sense. This was the calm before the storm, the moment where tension reached its peak before the first act of revelation would drop, where the full weight of strategy and patience would manifest in undeniable triumph. My mind wandered briefly to memories of early mornings in the vineyard, sunlight glinting off dew-laden leaves, the scent of earth and grapes, the quiet pride of tending something alive and enduring, and I drew strength from those recollections, knowing that the physical and emotional connection to the land was not just a motivator, but a shield against the petty threats flung across the boardroom table. With each exchange, each clipped sentence from the HOA president, I could feel the subtle shift in energy questions unanswered, arguments faltering, tiny hesitations revealing the cracks in their confidence, and it only fueled the sense of suspense, the anticipation that something larger, more dramatic, was imminent, a plan that would overturn the traditional hierarchy, not through brute force, but through intelligence, patience, and decisive action. At one point, the president's voice escalated into a crescendo, fingers stabbing the air, eyes narrowing, the classic current fury of someone whose sense of control was slipping, and I allowed a chuckle in my mind, savoring the irony, knowing that within weeks, this very confrontation would be reframed entirely in my favor, that the audience would witness the dramatic pivot from conflict to triumph, and that every frustrated gesture, every attempted intimidation would become a testament to the arrogance of those who underestimate patience, preparation, and legal foresight. The room seemed to shrink around them as I sat back slightly, meeting eyes with each member, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for tension to build, for anticipation to mount, for every viewer imagining the scene to feel the weight of impending revelation, and in that moment, I let my mind wander through the next steps, research, acquisition, confrontation on my own terms, and the eventual unveiling that would render every fine, every complaint, every petty effort at control completely irrelevant. By the time the meeting concluded, with papers shuffled, pens set down, and frustrated sighs filling the stale air, the board members left with a sense of unearned accomplishment, entirely unaware that their victory was an illusion, that the real power lay quietly, legally, and strategically in my hands, and that the first act of what would become a cinematic and satisfying story of confrontation, foresight, and ultimate triumph had only just begun, setting the stage for a larger narrative where patience, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of the vineyard and valley would lead to an undeniable, dramatic, and utterly satisfying reversal of fortune. The audience is left on edge, sensing that the next moves will be bold, strategic, and irreversible, that the petty authority wielded in this tense room will be eclipsed by legal ownership, planning, and a carefully orchestrated revelation, and that the vineyard, far from being a mere backdrop, is itself a character in the story, silent, enduring, and ever-present, poised to witness the ultimate vindication of patience, preparation, and rightful authority. The morning air was crisp, sunlight spilling through the tall windows of my home office, casting golden rectangles across stacks of maps, legal documents, and property deeds strewn across the polished oak desk. The smell of fresh paper mingling with faint hints of coffee and earth from the vineyard beyond. And as I leaned over the maps, tracing the boundaries of the valley with my fingertip, a thrill of anticipation coursed through me, a mixture of anxiety and excitement that made my pulse quicken as I imagined the possibilities lying dormant in these lines and parcels, lines that the HOA had never truly understood, parcels they had assumed were beyond my reach, and yet, buried within the tangle of legalese and historical records, I had begun to see the cracks, the hidden opportunities, loopholes and forgotten ownership clauses that could be leveraged to shift the balance entirely in my favor. The kind of revelation that could turn frustration into power, chaos into order, and petty HOA interference into inconsequential noise. And as I examined the old deeds, yellowed with age, their ink faded yet still legible, I could almost hear the whispers of past owners, their signatures a testament to continuity, legacy, and legal authority, a chain of ownership stretching back decades, patiently waiting for someone attentive enough to recognize the potential. And I realized that this was my moment, a chance, to take action that would be irreversible, undeniable, and spectacular in its finality. Hours slipped by unnoticed as I cross-referenced county records, noting discrepancies, overlapping claims, and gaps that had been overlooked by previous owners and, more importantly, by the overconfident HOA board. Their arrogance, their own undoing, for they had never imagined that someone like me, patient, detail-oriented, and legally savvy, would take the time to study every detail, follow every lead, and uncover the precise combination of facts and leverage that would allow me to secure complete ownership. And each discovery fueled my resolve, every highlighted clause and historical record a step closer to vindication and ultimate triumph. My excitement tempered only slightly by the anxiety that came with such a monumental undertaking, a thrill that made my hands tremble slightly as I reached for another deed, turning the page with deliberate care, imagining the look on the HOA president's face when the full scope of ownership was revealed, and how powerless all their threats, complaints, and fines would suddenly appear. The visual montage of the office itself told part of the story. Close-ups of my hands flipping through meticulously organized folders, the sunlight catching the edges of the documents, inked signatures shimmering slightly in the light, the maps pinned to corkboards with colored strings marking boundaries, dotted lines stretching across hills and valleys, aerial photographs clipped to the wall, providing context and a sense of scale, all combining to illustrate the obsessive focus and meticulous planning that was the foundation of what would soon become a masterstroke of strategy. And in that moment, I felt the perfect balance of tension and anticipation, knowing that the culmination of this research would be both thrilling and devastating in its effect on those who had underestimated me. Each call to legal advisors, each whispered conversation with previous property owners, each email exchanged and scanned historical record added another layer of certainty to the plan. And I repeated quietly under my breath, almost as a mantra, "If I can just acquire this property, they'll never see it coming." The words both a promise and a tether, keeping me focused as the hours stretched into days of research, negotiation, and careful maneuvering, each step deliberate, precise, and calculated to avoid detection until the moment of revelation, ensuring that when the deed was finally signed, the impact would be immediate and absolute. The cinematic beat was inevitable. The moment of acquisition, a meeting with the previous owner, who was surprisingly accommodating, a handshake. That sealed the transaction, the rustle of papers exchanged, stamps pressed, signatures flowing across pages like the culmination of years of planning condensed into a few decisive gestures. The subtle triumph in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as the legal reality of ownership finally crystallized, and the music in my mind rose in crescendo, a triumphant score underscoring the victory that had been earned through patience, strategy, and a deep understanding of the land and the law. Outside, the vineyard stretched endlessly under the warm light, hills rolling into valleys, rows of grapes rippling in the breeze. The perfect stage for the drama about to unfold, and I imagined the stunned faces of the HOA board, the disbelief, the anger, the dawning realization that all their rules, fines, and threats were now irrelevant, powerless against the simple, undeniable fact that the land, the vineyard, the valley, belonged to me, legally, irrevocably, and that their arrogance had blinded them to the very truth standing quietly before them. As I reviewed the final deeds, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to look out the window at the sun glinting off leaves, the soil dark and fertile, the entire expanse of the property a living, breathing testament to the culmination of planning, foresight, and quiet strategy, a landscape that had waited patiently for someone to recognize its full potential and claim it, and I felt an exhilaration that was almost spiritual in nature, a sense that I was both participant and observer in a story of justice, patience, and eventual triumph. The emotional beats of anxiety and excitement intertwined, a tightrope between anticipation and fear as the final signatures were witnessed, notarized, and recorded, the air heavy with significance and the knowledge that the next step, the public revelation, the dramatic confrontation with the HOA, would be even more powerful because it would be grounded in legality and strategy, not impulsive anger or rash action. And that understanding gave me a calm, confident energy that contrasted with the chaos that had previously defined interactions. With the board, turning past frustration into future victory, and the cinematic tension was almost palpable, the quiet before the storm, the moment when the audience senses that the inevitable twist is about to drop, that the landscape itself is now aligned with the protagonist, and that the narrative is poised for a dramatic shift. Every shot, every imagined frame captured the transformation, the maps on the walls, the piles of deeds on the desk, the careful notations in margins, the close-ups of my eyes scanning text, hands brushing over parchment, and finally, the handshake. The moment of completion that signaled not just a legal victory, but a personal triumph. A turning of the table so complete that it would redefine the relationship between authority, arrogance, and rightful ownership and leave the HOA scrambling for understanding in the aftermath. As the realization sank in, I allowed a slow, satisfied smile to form, imagining the subsequent encounters, the stunned expressions, the frantic attempts to assert control, the futile complaints and threats that would bounce harmlessly off the immovable wall of legality and strategy, and through it all, the vineyard and valley stood silent, majestic and unwavering, the ultimate character in this drama, bearing witness to the consequences of hubris and the rewards of patience, foresight, and meticulous planning, a cinematic tableau that captured not only the physical beauty of the land but the emotional and narrative weight of the story unfolding within it. By the end of this chapter, the audience is fully immersed in the tension and stakes, feeling the exhilaration of the plan coming together, the anticipation of the dramatic revelation to the HOA, and the satisfaction that comes from watching strategy, intelligence, and respect for legacy triumph over petty authority, setting the stage perfectly for Chapter 5, Turning the Tables, where the confrontation finally escalates and the payoff begins. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, painting the vineyard and the rolling valley beyond in shades of gold and amber, the light glinting off grapevines, casting long shadows across the meticulously tended rows, and I stood on the crest of a hill, surveying the vast expanse that was now unequivocally mine, the breeze tugging gently at my clothes as I let the weight of the moment sink in. The culmination of months of planning, research, and quiet anticipation. Knowing that every step I had taken, every loophole uncovered, every deed signed, had led to this precise instant of triumph. The camera capturing aerial shots that showcased the sheer scale of the property, the sprawling vineyard stretching toward distant tree lines, the sunlight reflecting off patches of water and irrigation channels, and the meticulous order of the land below, all silently asserting the truth of ownership in a way that words alone could never achieve. A visual testament to patience, foresight, and strategy. And yet the drama was far from over, because as the HOA members appeared at the edge of the property, their expressions a mixture of irritation, disbelief, and simmering arrogance. It became immediately clear that they had not anticipated this moment, that they still operated under the assumption that rules, fines, and threats could dictate actions on land they no longer controlled, their footsteps crunching against gravel. As they approached, papers fluttering in their hands and their voices raised in a cacophony of indignation and misplaced authority, trying desperately to assert control over a property that had quietly, legally, and irrevocably passed into my hands, and for a moment, the scene seemed almost theatrical, as though the valley itself had staged a confrontation designed to emphasize the absurdity of their assumptions. I allowed them to continue, observing every gesture, every pointed finger, every misdirected accusation, the tension building to a palpable crescendo, and when they finally paused, expecting compliance or resistance, I stepped forward, raising my hand just slightly, letting my gaze sweep over their faces and the surrounding vineyard, and in a calm, measured voice, I delivered the words that would seal the first true act of revelation. Actually, this is now private property. You're officially locked out. The silence that followed was immediate and electric. A suspension of disbelief as they absorbed the statement, eyes widening, jaws tightening, the color rising in their cheeks, and I could see the realization dawning slowly, painfully, as the gravity of the legal truth settled in. The sheer audacity of ownership now firmly in my favor, rendering all their complaints, all their fines, all their attempts at control utterly meaningless, a powerless reaction against a reality they had ignored, underestimated, and now could not undo, and the satisfaction coursing through me was both quiet and overwhelming. A deep, resonant sense of justice, empowerment, and vindication. The emotional payoff of months of careful planning condensed into a single, irrevocable moment. The neighbors, drawn out by curiosity or whispered rumors of the confrontation, began to appear along the edges of the property, their expressions a mixture of awe, amusement, and admiration, their whispers carrying across the vineyards as they tried to process the spectacle. He actually did it. He owns the entire valley, one murmured, while another stifled a laugh at the sight of the flustered HOA members, the dramatic irony almost too rich to ignore, and as the whispers spread, the power dynamic shifted further, the audience fully sensing the magnitude of the reversal, the satisfaction compounded by the visible shock of those who had once attempted to dictate rules and assert control over a space they no longer held any claim to, and the cinematic composition captured it all. Aerial shots of the valley, close-ups of incredulous faces, sweeping views of the vineyard, and the slow, deliberate focus on my calm, confident stance, hands resting lightly on a walking stick, eyes scanning the property, a quiet smirk betraying the knowledge that the battle had been won without a single act of aggression, only strategy, patience, and lawful assertion. The HOA president, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief, waved her papers helplessly, pointing at sections of the vineyard as though the act of pointing could somehow restore authority. Her husband stepping forward with a futile attempt to negotiate, voice raised in a trembling crescendo. "You can't do this. We'll have this reversed." And I allowed a slight, knowing smile, letting the absurdity of their indignation underscore the victory, my internal monologue reflecting on how predictably their arrogance had led them to underestimate not only the law but my resolve, and how the entire sequence had unfolded perfectly according to the plan I had crafted meticulously over weeks of research and preparation. Every detail of the scene amplified the emotional beats, the breeze rustling through the vines, the distant sound of farm equipment, the shifting light over the rolling hills, the subtle glint of sunlight on property deeds tucked into my pocket. all reinforcing the silent, visual statement of ownership, authority, and triumph. While the HOA members fumed, their gestures frantic, voices raised, yet utterly impotent against the legal reality, and the neighbors' quiet amusement only accentuated the contrast, creating an almost cinematic tableau of triumph, justice, and vindication that would resonate in the memory of all who witnessed it. The aerial shots emphasized scale and ownership, showing me standing small yet powerful against the expanse of vineyards and valley, a single figure whose control over the land was both absolute and undeniable. While the flustered board members scrambled in the foreground, papers fluttering, gestures wild, their attempts at authority reduced to a visual comedy of errors. And every frame told a story of contrast. Calm versus chaos, patience versus arrogance, preparation versus ignorance, and legal truth versus misguided power. As the confrontation unfolded, the emotional weight shifted seamlessly, from anticipation to revelation, from disbelief to empowerment, from tension to satisfaction, and the narrative conveyed not just a personal victory, but a moral triumph. A story of rightful ownership, strategic patience, and the consequences of underestimating someone who had quietly mastered both the law and the land, turning the mundane drama of HOA complaints into a cinematic moment of dramatic reversal, justice, served with elegance and precision. Neighbor reactions became a key visual and emotional element. Whispers of approval, stifled laughter at the comical frustration of the HOA, subtle nods of admiration, and a growing sense of community validation that underscored the protagonists' victory. While the board members remained isolated, their authority evaporated, their attempts to assert control rendered absurd, powerless against a strategy they had failed to anticipate. And the cinematic framing captured it all. Long aerial sweeps of the valley, medium shots of shocked HOA faces, close-ups of my calm expression, and cutaways to curious neighbors, weaving a visual narrative that reinforced the emotional beats and heightened the audience's engagement, leaving them invested in the unfolding saga. The dialogue, though minimal, carried weight and precision, each word a strategic tool. Actually, this is now private property. You're officially locked out, resonating across the space, echoing in the ears of the HOA members, amplified by the vast open landscape and serving as the turning point, the dramatic pivot in the story where preparation, law, and patience converged to deliver an undeniable reversal, leaving no room for argument, no escape from reality, and no doubt about the power dynamic that had shifted irreversibly in favor of the protagonist. The cinematic beat concluded with a slow pan across the valley, the morning sun reflecting off the leaves, the shadows of grapevines stretching long and deliberate, capturing the quiet grandeur of ownership and the irreversible nature of that victory, while the HOA members retreated in various states of shock, muttering incomprehensible complaints, gesturing at boundaries that no longer mattered, and the neighbors exchanged glances, smiles, and whispers of awe and amusement. The visual and emotional tableau complete, leaving the audience fully engaged, emotionally satisfied, and anticipating the next chapter where the community, the HOA, and the narrative consequences of this reversal would play out in even greater drama. Every detail, the sunlight, the breeze, the rows of vines, the shocked expressions, the murmurs of neighbors worked in concert to emphasize satisfaction, justice, and empowerment. The ultimate cinematic payoff for a long-fought struggle, and a narrative that blended tension, strategy, and emotional resonance into a single, unforgettable moment, setting the stage perfectly for the next chapter, Chapter 6, Community Reactions, where gossip, whispers, and neighborhood dynamics expand. The story's impact and heighten the stakes further by the time the word spread through the neighborhood. The morning haze had lifted, sunlight catching on rooftops and glinting off cars as neighbors gathered in small clusters along driveways, sidewalks, and the edges of the valley roads, their voices low but eager, a flurry of whispers, incredulous gasps, and muted laughter weaving through the air, the sheer absurdity of the situation fueling excitement as one hushed voice murmured to another, "He actually did it. He owns the whole valley." And another chimed in with barely contained amusement, "I can't believe the HOA is just standing there." While the HOA members themselves, still reeling from the revelation, convened another frantic meeting in their boardroom. Papers shuffled nervously. Pens clicked and tapped on polished wood. Voices rising in panic and confusion, every attempt to regain control flailing, and yet no argument, no policy, no demand could undo the fact that the land, the vineyard, the entire valley was legally and irrevocably mine. A truth that left them isolated and impotent, their expressions oscillating between disbelief, anger, and simmering embarrassment. And as the scene unfolded, the cinematic contrast between the calm, measured presence of the protagonist overlooking the valley from the vineyard's highest hill and the chaotic, flustered gestures of the HOA board members created a visual metaphor for power, strategy, and triumph, emphasizing the dramatic irony that the audience, aware of every legal maneuver and calculated step, fully appreciated while the HOA still struggled to comprehend the situation. Neighbors' reactions were layered and complex. Some approached with cautious admiration, nodding in recognition of the cleverness, patience, and foresight required to achieve such a definitive victory, while others lingered with curious skepticism, their eyes darting between the vineyard, the valley, and the HOA board's frantic movements, unsure whether to laugh, cheer, or simply remain silent, a tension that underscored the social and emotional stakes of the unfolding drama. And every whispered conversation, every stifled laugh, every side-eye glance captured the communal acknowledgement of a power shift that was both surprising and satisfying, turning a local squabble over property and rules into a spectacle of social theater. From above, aerial shots revealed the scale of the transformation. The vineyard stretching across the valley floor, rows of grapevines neat and gleaming in the sun, shadows stretching long with the late morning light, and in the distance, the HOA board members clustered around tables, gesturing wildly, their papers flapping uselessly in the breeze, a visual symphony of panic and futility juxtaposed with the calm dominance of ownership. The protagonist's figure standing firmly on a hilltop, surveying the scene with quiet satisfaction, embodying the thematic essence of patience, strategy, and rightful assertion, the cinematic composition emphasizing both the scope of the property and the narrative weight of triumph over petty authority. The emotional beats were palpable, validation flowed through the protagonist as the neighbors' whispers confirmed what legal documents had already secured. Humor threaded through the visual tableau as the HOA's futile attempts at control became increasingly absurd, and tension simmered beneath the surface as the audience anticipated the next moves, knowing that while one battle had been decisively won, social and bureaucratic ripples were only beginning to spread, creating a layered narrative where strategy, law, and human psychology intertwined seamlessly. In alleyways, on front porches, and along the winding valley roads, neighbors exchanged theories, speculation, and outright gossip. "I never thought he'd actually pull it off." "The HOA has no chance now," said one, leaning on a fence and laughing softly, while another whispered, "Do you think they'll try to fight him in court?" And a small crowd nodded knowingly, recognizing both the ingenuity and inevitability of the protagonist's plan, a communal understanding that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and that authority built on arrogance rather than reason was no match for patience, preparation, and a firm grasp of both law and land. Meanwhile, the HOA's boardroom became a stage of escalating absurdity. One member waved a contract and shouted, "This isn't legal. We can stop him," while another frantically paged through old HOA bylaws, searching for loopholes that simply didn't exist, their panic almost comical against the backdrop of the sprawling vineyard and valley beyond the windows. The camera, capturing medium shots of each flustered expression, close-ups of trembling hands, and wide-angle perspectives that emphasized their isolation in the grand scale of the property they once thought they controlled, creating a visual and narrative contrast that highlighted the futility of their resistance and the inevitability of the protagonist's triumph. Every whisper from the neighborhood, every stunned gesture from the HOA, added layers to the story. Community validation reinforced the satisfaction and empowerment of victory. Humor undercut the absurdity of bureaucratic arrogance, and tension lingered as the social implications unfolded, leaving the audience eager for the next chapter, curious to see how neighbors would continue to react, how the HOA would attempt to recover or adapt, and how the protagonist would navigate this new equilibrium of power, all while maintaining a calm, confident presence that underscored both legal authority and personal mastery of the situation. The protagonist's internal monologue, though largely silent to the neighbors, reflected a mixture of amusement, pride, and strategic anticipation, noting every reaction, cataloging every expression, and imagining how the HOA members would recount their humiliation in future meetings, while the surrounding neighbors provided a living chorus of validation, incredulity, and subtle cheer, their murmurs amplifying the dramatic irony that the audience was already savoring. Those who had sought to control the land were powerless against the combination of patience, planning, and legal ownership, and the narrative satisfaction lay not just in the acquisition of property, but in the social acknowledgement of victory. As the sun climbed higher, the cinematic visuals continued to reinforce the story. The valley bathed in warm light, the vineyard perfectly aligned in neat rows, the protagonist standing solidly atop the hill, neighbors scattered along fences and pathways, observing, whispering, laughing softly, and the HOA members isolated and panicked in their meeting, creating a layered tableau of triumph, irony, and human behavior, each frame telling multiple stories simultaneously. The visual and emotional composition capturing the full weight of the narrative payoff, and the audience fully absorbed in the spectacle, sensing the culmination of strategy, law, and human psychology converging in one decisive, satisfying moment. The emotional resonance deepened further as whispers carried across property lines, forming a collective acknowledgement of the cleverness and inevitability of the protagonist's success. "I can't believe they actually pulled it off," muttered one neighbor, while another added with a grin, "All those fines?" Meaningless now, and the humor threaded through the community, contrasting beautifully with the stunned, frustrated, and ultimately powerless HOA members, whose repeated attempts to regain authority only underscored the narrative lesson that arrogance, ignorance, and rigid control were no match for foresight, preparation, and rightful ownership, all captured in a cinematic blend of wide shots, close-ups, and aerial perspectives that emphasized scale, emotion, and dramatic irony simultaneously. By the end of this chapter, the audience is fully immersed in the neighborhood's reaction. The tension between validation and lingering social dynamics, the humor of HOA futility, and the emotional payoff of the protagonist's triumph, setting the stage perfectly for Chapter 7, HOA's Last Stand, where desperation, creative tactics, and escalating tension bring the story to the next dramatic level, ensuring that viewers remain engaged, emotionally invested, and eager for the ultimate resolution of this property, power, and personal vindication saga. Dark clouds rolled across the valley, casting a brooding shadow over the vineyards as if nature itself had been enlisted to mirror the rising tension. The wind whipping through the rows of grapevines, leaves rustling and branches swaying, while the HOA members, still reeling from the shock of losing control, convened emergency meetings that seemed increasingly frantic and desperate, papers trembling in their hands, legal documents shuffled repeatedly, pens tapping nervously against polished tables, their voices rising in indignation, a chorus of panic and fury that contrasted sharply with the calm, methodical presence I maintained from a hilltop overlooking the property, the cinematography almost palpable in its juxtaposition. Close-ups capturing each anxious gesture, each narrowing eye, each trembling jaw, as if the storm outside was a visual echo of the chaos within. And yet through it all, I remained grounded, my smirk subtle but deliberate, fingers tracing the edges of the vineyard map I held, deeds stacked neatly beside me, every detail a reminder that patience, preparation, and legal authority had already secured my victory, leaving the HOA's theatrics entirely impotent. The board president's voice rang out, sharp and piercing, "This isn't over." Accompanied by flailing arms and pointed fingers, a futile attempt to reassert control while her husband slammed fists on the table, muttering about lawsuits, petitions, and imagined grievances that could somehow reverse the undeniable reality of ownership, their desperation almost theatrical. Each statement and gesture punctuated by dramatic storm clouds and gusts of wind that rustled papers and whipped hair into disarray, creating a cinematic tableau of tension, suspense, and a touch of humor, as the absurdity of their struggle became increasingly clear against the backdrop of the serene, Expansive vineyard below, perfectly aligned and utterly under my control. Every action they took, every frantic motion, every poorly calculated threat served only to amplify the dramatic irony. The audience could see clearly that their efforts were doomed. Their authority evaporated, while I, calm and confident, observed, letting each futile attempt unfold with meticulous attention, mentally cataloging each misstep, savoring the humor of their impotent fury, and noting how predictably arrogance had led them to underestimate both the law and the patience of someone who had mastered it, and in that quiet observation lay a profound emotional beat of satisfaction, empowerment, and quiet triumph. Lawsuits were drafted, complaints filed with local authorities, petitions circulated among neighbors, all of which I tracked silently, reading each new document with a barely perceptible shake of the head, acknowledging the creativity and sheer persistence in their desperation, but fully aware that none of these measures had legal weight against the ownership now secured. And the cinematic framing emphasized the futility. Close-ups of trembling hands, furrowed brows, and frantic expressions intercut with wide shots of the tranquil vineyard stretching endlessly into the distance. A visual reminder of reality versus illusion, control versus chaos, and strategy versus panic, leaving viewers both amused and deeply satisfied at the inevitable outcome. The storm outside intensified as if accentuating every emotional beat, lightning flashing briefly over rows of grapes, rain beginning to fall in light sheets, dripping from leaves and glinting in the fading sunlight, while the HOA board members shouted over one another, desperate to reclaim authority, unaware that their words were empty against the unassailable combination of legal ownership and strategic patience. And I allowed myself a slow, deliberate smile, a subtle acknowledgement to the audience that the battle had already been won. The final confrontation merely a formality, a dramatic crescendo designed to highlight their futility, their frustration, and the ultimate triumph of foresight and calm control. Internal monologues traced the unfolding chaos, cataloging the absurdity and reinforcing a sense of satisfaction. Every complaint they filed, every petition circulated, every attempt to recruit neighbors to their side only served to solidify the narrative that their power was illusory, while my legal and strategic authority was absolute. And as the camera panned across the stormy valley, capturing both the visual grandeur of the land and the futile desperation of the HOA, the emotional beats of suspense, humor, and quiet satisfaction intertwined seamlessly, creating a cinematic rhythm that heightened audience engagement and anticipation for the final resolution. The president's attempts to sway neighbors were equally ineffective, her voice rising over the muttered whispers of those who had already witnessed the legal shift, each phrase met with polite, bemused, or outright skeptical expressions, the audience sensing the irony in the social dynamics as well as the legal reality, and aerial shots captured both sides of the story, the chaotic, storm-lashed HOA members in close quarters versus the serene, ordered vineyard sprawling beneath. The clouds, every row of grapevines a silent testament to careful planning and patient strategy. While I remained a composed figure, the smirk never leaving my face, the deeds and maps a visual reinforcement of authority, power, and narrative inevitability. The emotional tension was punctuated by subtle humor. The absurdity of human desperation contrasted with the calm and unstoppable reality of ownership, a cinematic device that allowed the audience to both sympathize with the protagonist and relish the poetic justice unfolding, each frame reinforcing the lesson that arrogance, impatience, and petty authority could not prevail against foresight, preparation, and legal acumen, while dramatic gestures from the HOA board, from shouted threats to frantic scribbling, became almost comically ineffective in comparison, heightening the entertainment value while maintaining narrative tension. As the storm raged, close-ups captured the shifting emotions on the board members' faces: frustration, disbelief, anger, and finally resignation. Subtle micro-expressions betraying the dawning understanding that their last stand was failing. While I remained calm, almost meditative, holding the map delicately in one hand, deeds in the other, watching the chaos unfold with a sense of narrative mastery, the cinematic slow motion capturing each smirk, each calm breath, and each subtle, victorious glance toward the valley below, reinforcing the theme of measured patience versus frantic, desperation, strategy versus arrogance, and legal authority versus empty threats. Even as the HOA attempted procedural maneuvers, calling in lawyers, drafting complaints, and planning petitions, every action played out in a rhythm that emphasized futility, the cinematography cutting between stormy skies, flustered faces, and the expansive, serene vineyard, highlighting contrast and dramatic irony. While the audience remained fully aware that each desperate measure was insufficient, each effort trivial, and that the ultimate resolution was already determined, the tension serving only to accentuate the satisfaction and empowerment that would soon reach its narrative climax. The emotional beats, suspense, tension, humor, empowerment coalesced as the storm began to break, light filtering through clouds, rain falling in soft sheets over perfectly aligned grapevines, the visual metaphor complete, chaos attempting to assert itself over order, desperation against preparation, hubris against patience, all framed in a cinematic tapestry that allowed viewers to feel the full weight of narrative justice. The HOA's last stand both entertaining and instructive, and the protagonist's calm dominance unmistakable. By the end of this chapter, the audience is fully engaged, invested in both the humiliation of the HOA and the satisfaction of rightful victory, with every cinematic element from stormy weather and aerial shots to close-ups of frustration and slow-motion smirks reinforcing the central themes of patience, strategy, and empowerment, setting the stage for the next chapter. Chapter 8. Epic payoff where ultimate triumph, serenity, and justice converge in a visually and emotionally satisfying conclusion. The sun dipped slowly toward the horizon, painting the vineyard and rolling valley in deep shades of gold, amber, and crimson, the light catching off the leaves and grapevines, creating a glittering mosaic across the perfectly aligned rows, while gentle breezes whispered through the treetops and stirred ripples across the small lake at the far edge of the property. Reflections of the sky mirrored perfectly in its still surface, and I stood on the highest hilltop, surveying the entire expanse of land now fully and indisputably mine, the silence profound, punctuated only by distant birdsong and the occasional rustle of leaves, a stark contrast to the chaos of past weeks. And yet the weight of victory settled on my shoulders with a quiet dignity, a reminder that this moment had been earned through patience, meticulous planning, and unwavering focus, the cinematic drone shots capturing every curve of the valley, every cluster of vines, every patch of sunlight glinting off water or dew-laden leaves, emphasizing the vastness of ownership and the peace of finality. And as I breathed deeply, the internal monologue formed almost automatically. They tried to control me. Now I control the valley, a thought both triumphant and meditative, a statement that carried the full emotional resonance of justice served, empowerment achieved, and strategy perfected. Below, the empty docks by the water's edge shimmered. In the fading sunlight, each plank casting long shadows, a visual metaphor for authority reclaimed, spaces once potentially contested now entirely under my quiet dominion, while the vineyard stretched endlessly in neat parallel rows, each grapevine a testament to cultivation, care, and foresight, all of it captured in sweeping aerial shots that emphasized the scale of the land and the dramatic reversal of power, a visual celebration of triumph and the poetic justice that had unfolded, and yet the emotional payoff extended beyond the physical property. For the HOA, powerless and flustered, had retreated to the edges of the valley. Visible from a distance, their gestures futile, their complaints whispered into the wind and absorbed by the sprawling landscape, the visual of them standing helplessly, framed perfectly against the golden light, a cinematic juxtaposition that amplified satisfaction, humor, and moral closure simultaneously. Neighbors had begun to gather, at a respectful distance, their whispers, smiles, and nods of approval creating a social echo of the triumph already legally secured, and while some remained cautious, skeptical of engaging too openly, the general sentiment was unmistakable: admiration for cleverness, respect for patience, and recognition of the undeniable power of strategic action, their reactions forming a living soundtrack to the serene visuals of sun-drenched vineyards, reflective waters, and a protagonist fully in command of the landscape, a silent yet emotionally charged celebration of justice and order restored. The camera angle shifted seamlessly, alternating between close-ups of my calm, confident expression, slow pans across the shimmering water and vineyard, and wide aerial sweeps that captured both scale and context, each frame designed to reinforce the emotional beats of triumph, satisfaction, and empowerment. The narrative tension resolved elegantly through both visual storytelling and internal reflection, the cinematic rhythm flowing naturally as viewers were invited to absorb the scope of victory, the depth of planning, and the beauty of the reclaimed land. The combination of light, shadow, and aerial perspective creating an almost painterly tableau, each image imbued with meaning beyond the surface, a testament to perseverance, foresight, and the quiet satisfaction of proving naysayers wrong. The emotional landscape was complex yet harmonious, blending ultimate satisfaction with subtle humor at the HOS impotence, anticipation of future security, and pride in careful planning. The internal monologue serving as both a narrative anchor and an emotional lens. Every breeze, every ripple of water, every shaft of sunlight reflected the personal journey from frustration and conflict to calm, strategic triumph, reinforcing the sense that justice had not only been served but observed, validated, and visually immortalized. Across the sprawling property, while the once oppressive presence of the HOA had been reduced to a faint, impotent outline in the distance, their authority evaporated against the undeniable, legal, and strategic reality of ownership. As the sun sank lower, the sky transitioned into a warm, glowing palette of reds, oranges, and purples. The reflections on the water deepening, the vineyard bathed in twilight, and every visual element, from the meticulous rows of grapevines to the serene lake and the scattered figures of powerless HOA members, told a story of strategic patience rewarded, arrogance humbled, and rightful ownership affirmed, each frame capturing the interplay between human drama and natural beauty, between calculated action and poetic justice, while the protagonist remained the calm center of the narrative, surveying the land with a quiet smile, hands resting on a walking stick, fingers brushing lightly against the topographic map tucked into a satchel, a subtle visual reminder of the careful planning that had made this victory possible. Aerial shots emphasized the immensity of the valley, the golden sunlight catching on leaves, the gentle shadows stretching across rows of vines, and in the distance, the HOA board members, tiny and flustered, gesturing futilely their presence. Almost comically overwhelmed by the sheer scale and serenity of the land, a visual metaphor that enhanced both humor and satisfaction, while the internal monologue reflected the calm authority and measured triumph of someone who had orchestrated events to perfection, absorbing every detail and savoring the poetic justice of seeing hubris humbled in real time. Neighbors continued to witness the scene from afar, whispers passing along property lines, expressions ranging from awe to amusement, and the subtle gestures of acknowledgement reinforced the social validation of victory, a human echo of the legal and strategic triumph, the combination of personal satisfaction, moral vindication, and community acknowledgement forming the emotional core of the cinematic tableau, a narrative payoff both visually stunning and emotionally resonant, while the sun's descent painted the entire valley in a final, glorious light, highlighting every contour, shadow, and glint of water, creating an almost magical backdrop for the concluding moments of this chapter, signaling peace, mastery, and the ultimate triumph of foresight over petty authority. The calmness of the vineyard, the reflections in the lake, and the golden rays illuminating the valley reinforced the theme of resolution. The HOA's impotence captured in wide shots of their retreating figures, the protagonist standing firm as a symbol of calculated patience rewarded, justice served, and strategy realized, and the subtle humor of their futile gestures added layer of satisfaction, creating a multifaceted emotional experience for the audience, one that combined triumph, relief, amusement, and awe, all framed within a cinematic visual tapestry designed to maximize emotional engagement and narrative payoff. Internal reflection deepened the emotional resonance. The thought, "They tried to control me. Now I control the valley," encapsulated the journey from conflict to resolution, frustration to empowerment, arrogance to humility, and established a moral and emotional anchor for viewers, linking strategic action with personal satisfaction. And the visual grandeur of the property, the cinematic and narrative arcs converging in perfect harmony, creating a chapter that felt both complete and awe-inspiring. The final aerial shot swept across the valley as the sun touched the horizon, the vineyard bathed in warm twilight, the lake perfectly still, the shadows stretching long and soft, and in the distance, the HOA board members' gestures futile and impotent, their authority extinguished against the calm, patient, and meticulously planned triumph of the protagonist. Every frame reinforcing the themes of strategic victory, poetic justice, and ultimate empowerment, leaving viewers emotionally satisfied while maintaining a lingering sense of awe at the scope, beauty, and narrative resolution perfectly setting the stage for the concluding Chapter 9, Reflection and Moral, where the story's emotional, strategic, and moral lessons will be distilled into quiet, thoughtful closure. The evening settled gently over the vineyard, a soft twilight casting long amber shadows across the rows of grapevines, the sky painted in delicate hues of pink, purple, and gold as if nature itself was signaling both closure and reflection, while the air carried a subtle, calming breeze that rustled leaves and stirred the scent of ripening grapes, the perfect backdrop for introspection after weeks of conflicts, strategy, and ultimate triumph, and I found myself sitting on the creaky wooden bench near the highest hilltop, the vineyard sprawling below in perfect order, the lake reflecting the fading sky like a mirror, a serene contrast to the stormy chaos of past confrontations, and as I leaned back, the weight of victory settled in my chest, not just the legal triumph or the strategic mastery that had humbled the HOA, but the deeper satisfaction of seeing arrogance confronted, impatience punished, and foresight rewarded, a lesson writ large across every leaf, row, and contour of the land, and in that quiet moment, the emotional complexity of the journey became fully apparent, blending satisfaction with a touch of humor, empowerment with a gentle humility, as I reflected on the absurdity of some of the conflicts, the frantic gestures, the misplaced confidence, and the comical futility of their attempts to control what was never theirs to command. My thoughts wandered to the HOA members, still visible from afar, their forms small and powerless against the grandeur of the valley, and I could almost hear their whispered mutterings, their stunned exclamations, and their futile arguments as they tried to reconcile authority with reality, a dynamic that underscored not only the cleverness of the legal and strategic victory, but also the timeless lesson that control imposed through arrogance and rules alone is no match for patience, preparation, and rightful action. And I allowed a chuckle to escape, a soft recognition of how predictably human folly often unfolds when hubris meets reality, and the camera lingered on these moments, capturing close-ups of my thoughtful expression, slow pans over the calm lake and aerial shots of the serene vineyard, emphasizing both the beauty of the land and the internal resonance of justice achieved. The internal monologue, as always, provided a window into both emotion and philosophy. Sometimes the only way to win is to play by your own rules, a thought that crystallized the journey, reflecting on the necessity of strategy when confronted with unfair authority, the wisdom and patience when facing obstinate opposition, and the empowerment that comes from leveraging knowledge, preparation, and calm decisiveness, a moral both personal and universally relatable, resonating with viewers as they considered the balance of fairness, resilience, and the courage to assert oneself in situations where the rules have been manipulated or the system skewed, the cinematic composition reinforcing every nuance through light, shadow, and perspective, every visual echoing the layered lessons of the narrative. The evening deepened, stars beginning to appear like scattered diamonds in the sky, the vineyard now bathed in soft moonlight, the rows of grapevines casting gentle shadows across the ground, and in that quiet, almost sacred moment, humor of past frustrations and conflicts mingled with the solemnity of victory, a bittersweet cocktail of emotions that highlighted not only personal triumph, but the universal satisfaction of seeing patience, strategy, and foresight vindicated, while the HOS powerless figures in the distance remained a subtle reminder of the folly of arrogance, the limits of imposed authority, and the poetic justice of seeing expectation overturned most elegantly and decisively. Neighbors, still aware of the events but now relaxed in their distance, murmured among themselves, sharing quiet approval, gentle laughter, or reflective nods, their reactions a social validation of the narrative that had unfolded, reinforcing the emotional beats of empowerment and satisfaction, while the visual focus remained on the calm and composed protagonist, surveying the land with a soft smile, hands resting lightly on the wooden bench, eyes tracing the curves of the valley. The lake and the meticulously arranged vineyard, a living testament to patience, planning, and rightful action, the slow, sweeping aerial shots capturing the entire panorama, emphasizing scale, serenity, and the moral weight of the journey, and allowing viewers to absorb both the story's resolution and the subtle, layered lessons embedded within. Dialogue, though sparse in this reflective moment, carried resonance and intentionality. The words, "Sometimes the only way to win is to play by your own rules," echoed softly, a mantra for empowerment, strategy, and resilience, a reminder that fairness and authority often exist in tension, and that knowing when and how to assert one's rights with intelligence and composure can transform conflict into decisive victory, all underscored visually through the interplay of twilight, shadows, reflections, and the soft glow of the moon emerging over the valley. The emotional beats continued to unfold naturally. The bittersweet satisfaction of seeing authority humbled, the humor found in observing the absurdity of previous conflicts, the calm empowerment of controlling one's destiny, and the subtle social acknowledgement from neighbors, all merging into a cohesive narrative arc that reinforced the story's moral, the cinematic language amplifying every nuance of emotion, reflection, and visual beauty, while the pacing allowed viewers to breathe, absorb, and reflect alongside. The protagonist, the landscape itself serving as both metaphor and reinforcement of the journey's lessons. The night deepened, stars reflected faintly in the lake's surface, shadows blending with moonlight, the vineyard silent except for occasional nocturnal rustles. And in that peaceful setting, the internal monologue expanded, connecting personal experience with universal reflection, the folly of arrogance, the importance of foresight, the satisfaction of justice, and the humor inherent in human stubbornness all crystallized into a single, coherent understanding mirrored. In the calm, ordered rows of grapevines, the reflective water, and the gentle sway of trees, cinematic visuals reinforcing the thematic resonance of reflection, empowerment, and moral clarity. As the chapter closed, the CTA emerged naturally, a gentle prompt embedded within the reflection. Viewers were invited to consider their own responses to unfair authority, the balance of patience, strategy, and moral courage, or to anticipate the next adventure, the next challenge where foresight, preparation, and composure could again transform conflict into triumph, and the final wide shots of the vineyard and valley, bathed in soft moonlight and twinkling starlight, framed the protagonist as the calm center of this moral and emotional universe, the ultimate embodiment of the story's themes, the cinematic narrative complete, and the audience left with both satisfaction and reflection, a closing tableau that honored victory, justice, humor, and the timeless lesson that playing by one's own rules strategically, patiently, and wisely can turn adversity into lasting empowerment.